And I'll finally pick up what Philipp Schoeller said. Is he still around? Yeah, okay. Because I felt quite inspired by what he said. So let me run through the story. And now we have to create a cinema atmosphere, because you have to really watch this movie here, which has incorporated billions of data. And it's the story of how we became what we are today. It's the story of human civilization and the modern age, but not in terms, you know, I call it the sea story of human civilization, not the history. It's not a story of battlefields and beautiful princesses and dragons and, you know, the usual history. It's not the Game of Thrones. It's the development of the industrial metabolism of this planet. Through the emissions of CO2, and what you see there is actually down there, the color coding means these are the cumulative carbon dioxide emissions from each and every pixel on this planet since 1751. You can imagine that's quite a task to put that together. And whenever the color changes, you have a tenfolding of the cumulative emissions. So it's a logarithmic scale, but it's very, very important. So let's get started. And it does not start. So let me see again. Now it starts. That's always the suspension. Cliffhanger thing, but it works. So, but it doesn't go on. Interesting. Now it goes. So, watch out. The only colored spot on this planet is the UK here. Scotland and England, which had to resort to coal because we had cut down all the forests. So you had to use this ugly material called coal. If you want to have a chimney fed with coal, it's quite an unpleasant thing, actually. So you see, still it's only England and Scotland. And what is the second country in the world that will switch to? It's Germany, actually. And the third one is Poland. So if you think of why are the Polish so obsessed with coal, they are the third to join the party here. You see it now on the other side of the Atlantic, America, Europe, driven by the textile industry, actually. So carbonization was driven. Industrial revolution was moving forward. You see nothing in Africa, nothing in Australia, nothing in Asia or Latin America until the British Empire will kick in. So India will appear on the map, New South Wales, and a few other places. So now we are in the 1850s, and now India is appearing, as you can see, for the British Empire. But in Europe, in old Europe, Germany is now developing into a second carbon power. And it will catch up in color with the UK soon. Now you see Russia, New South Wales, as I have said. South Africa will appear, Argentina, and so on here. And we are moving towards the First World War. And the First World War, in my view, was in particular a clash between carbon powers. Because how do you create wealth and fortune? So we are approaching, you see Germany is turning red now. Now the First World War starts. Now it ends, but the tensions have not been released. So Hitler will soon take power in Germany in 1933. And Germany keeps on, through military and everything, keeps on developing into a carbon power. Japan has now joined the party. And together with Germany is fighting, you know, the Allied forces. We are through the Second World War. Now what is starting is the age of globalization. Not because of coal, because of cheap oil from the Middle East, because the geostrategic situation has been completely changed. And now we are in the middle of the globalization. You see the Industrial Revolution rages on, creeps into every part of the planet, and now finally the new carbon power emerges, China. And within just 2 decades, these are cumulative emissions, within just 2 decades, China is catching up actually with old Europe. And so you see it will turn red now. The whole thing stops, I guess, in 2013 or something, or 2011. And now you see the map of the world. That is the industrial metabolism of our planet. And if you would now look at where is wealth, where is population density and so on, it perfectly fits that type of emissions chart. And now you could ask, what is the future of development? Should the whole planet turn red? And when we are done? Yes, when we are done, because when our climate will be completely destabilized. But we are on track already in this regard. So let me see if I can move it forward. Yes. So this is what you probably have seen, the weekly line since 1880, since we have instrumental records, how the global mean temperature is going up. And you see it's going up and up and up, and you have a few wiggles, Pinatubo, volcano eruption, with slight cooling because of the air pollution. In an El Nino event, we just had a massive one. It's accelerated in a La Nina phase. It may go down a little bit, but all in all, it's moving upwards. And the last 3 years, actually, were always record years. If this would be a stationary climate, the chance of that would be 1 in a million. So if you still think global warming is not happening, when you should rather go to a lottery, actually. So let me go on here. And so what are we going to do? We go to Paris and have a nice summit, and you see the jubilant mode. In the end, I was there too, so sorry, I get back to that. And you see, in particular, what Ernst has already mentioned, there was an agreement to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees and to even aspire for 1.5 degrees warming. Now, as a physicist, I'm, on the one hand, absolutely pleased with that. On the other hand, I'm frightened to death because it's a little bit like if you would just by law prohibit earthquakes bigger than 7 on the Richter scale. And whether nature will comply with that, we don't know. But in particular, these are not the forces of nature, it's the forces of humanity, the Trumps and the like. So can we really hold that line? That's the question. Why should we hold it? I also introduced, Ernst, as you know, this notion of tipping elements, tipping points in the Earth system. This is the chart, this is the physiology of our planet. These are the vital organs, the jet stream, the thermaline circulation, the big ecosystems like the Great Barrier Reef, the ice sheet, and so on. And actually, if we heat up the planet, we will not have one big bang. Rather, vital organs will be collapsed or pushed into a different mode of operation as we go. And I'll show you how this will happen, actually. So, if we have 1.5 degrees warming only, now we have 1 degree, we will lose practically all tropical coral reefs. And if you ever had a chance to snorkel in a tropical reef, it's one of the miracles of the world. They will be gone with 1.5 degrees warming already. The next one, the Greenland ice sheet, worth 7 meters of sea level rise. We think that it will start melting around 1.6 degrees. And you can go on. And this is the summary, actually, I just published this in Nature this year. And this is more or less telling you the whole story, why 2 degrees is reasonable, and also how far we are behind our schedule. So, bear with me for a minute on that chart here. You see the line below is global mean temperature as we have reconstructed 20,000 years ago. From the Ice Age emerging, we had just 3 degrees warming to pre-industrial, just 3 degrees. When on the right-hand side, what you see are the various scenarios. The most optimistic scenario by the IPCC is the green one, where we have a spike up to 1.5 degrees warming, and then we stabilize. But we are actually on the red curve. The business as usual curve will bring us to 8 degrees warming by 2500, that's the path we are on right now. And when you see the Paris range, this gray bar, horizontal bar, 1.5 to 2 degrees, we want to land planet Earth somewhere within this strip, landing strip. And what you finally see are the various arrow bars for the tipping points here. So we cannot say precisely. With the coral reefs, we are fairly precise. With the West Antarctic ice sheet, that's the first bar, some parts are already collapsing, but we do not know what the majority of the ice will do in the end. So it may only melt down completely at 4 or 5 degrees warming. But what you see is we are already in the middle of the first cluster of tipping points. So even if we hold the 1.5 degrees line, which is very aspirational, we are not in safe territory. So we have lost the plot already. If we would have done this agreement 3 decades ago, we could have still avoided to enter this high-risk territory. Now we are in the middle of it. That means if we are able to save the world, and this is damn difficult, we also need a little bit of luck. Actually, we need more luck, what do you say in German, when we have brains. So, but since we have not so much brains, we might have much more luck, and we hope for that, including myself. So this is why the problem is such a wicked problem, and in this interview for the Washington Post, I was just referring to it, because historians in 500 years from now may see in the sediments on the ocean the so-called Trump anomaly. The financial crisis was creating an emissions anomaly downward. We may see a spike going upwards. The problem is that it is the cumulative emissions that really count. So, of course, we could somehow go to zero emissions in 2050, some way. But what happens before? And it's the integral, the area under the emissions curve that really counts. Because 1 ton of CO2 emitted today will stay within the overall Earth system for half decade time, 34,000 years. Longer than plutonium. Very few people know this. Of course it will be sucked up by the oceans, but it will be re-emitted. It goes into a tree, the tree will be rotten and so on. So, whatever you emit now, and whatever the American economy will now add to the emissions worldwide, will not be forgiven and not be forgotten by the atmosphere. That's the bad thing. And this is the likelihood of exceeding it. More or less tells you we have just 400 gigatons CO2 left if we want to stay below 1.5 degrees. That is worth 10 years of emissions. So, this is what we are up against. So I skip that. I think you are depressed enough already, so I don't have to add anything to that. What are we going to do about it? So let me see. Okay, this is what we have to do. I just directly... So the orange corridor, because there are a lot of uncertainties, is what has been decided so far in Paris and pre-Paris, the so-called national determined contributions, and you see it would bring us into a realm where global warming would be 3 to 4 degrees by the end of the century. It's the blue corridor which we have to follow, and that means in particular we have to have carbon neutrality around 2070, and the steps are redirecting investment. You know it all. We have to, let me see, power sector decarbonization, coal phase out by 2025 worldwide. Carbon neutral economy regarding freight, aviation, shipping, heavy industry, and so on. And finally, another thing that happened. And finally, we have to go negative by planting trees, maybe by some monster technologies which we do not even want to think of. If you now look to 1.5 degrees, we have to actually decarbonize the world by 2040 completely. Now this is a middle of the road scenario. Of course, if you say something like that, whether I talk to Angela Merkel or who else, I mean, she takes it in a different way. She's a scientist, but people would say, you're an alarmist. You just want to scare us into non-profitable ways of doing business and so on. And this is the middle of the road scenario. We must not shirk our responsibility and just lull ourselves in a false sense of feasibility and responsibility here. We have to actually decarbonize the world by 2040. Whether we then will go negative, I don't know. I do not even want to know. That's a completely different thing. First things first, last things last. So those people who dream up geoengineering and so on, they talk about what we will do if we have done nothing for the next 4 decades. Let's rather do something now, of course. And then we can think of all Frankensteinian methodologies in order to save the planet for good. Okay, so let me see. We can just move there. This would be the scenario for 1.5 degrees. We just put it together, German Advisory Council. It means more or less that by 2030 you have a turning point where you turn around the old fossil energy mix into a renewable one. And you have finished this task by 2050. If you would look in precise terms, oil and coal have to disappear very soon. Gas will play a certain role for a while, but that's the only fossil fuel. So, German Energiewende, Claudia Kempfert has referred to that. But this is what gives us hope. If you look, my friend Steve Chu has provided that. He was the Minister for the Energy in the United States, Secretary of State. I don't think Trump will reappoint him. He's also a laureate in physics, a Nobel laureate in physics. And you have the tremendous decay of cost in LEDs, as you can see, 94% over 7 years only, in land-based wind, in modeled battery costs and so on. And you can, this is a very important slide here. It gives you, again, in a logarithmic scale, that's very important. In a logarithmic scale, what you see is the coal fuel price for electricity generation, that's the black line, nuclear, and solar energy. And solar energy is going down exponentially, obviously. You will have the break-even point, the so-called sunshot target, in a few years from now. The interesting thing is nuclear is not becoming cheaper in any way per kilowatt hour. And the tiny little red cross you see there, that's Hinkley Point. So you will even have an increase in costs per kilowatt hours. That does, by the way, not include decommissioning, insurance, and getting rid of nuclear waste. So it's the worst business case in the history of mankind, actually. So we have to do it without that. We have to do it without fossil fuels. We have to do it without coal, of course, because coal is also not coming down. So, let me see. I'll skip all that. Let me end with, yes, great visionaries, part 1. The first great visionary is Malcolm Turnbull. When I talked to him 7 years ago, he was all for renewable energies. Now he's the sitting prime minister, and what he said is, just recently, coal is going to be an important part of our energy mix. There's no question about it for many, many, many decades to come. Now, I'm a physicist. Many means for us about factor 10. Many, many, many means 10 times 10 times 10. That is 1,000 years. A very bold prediction by Malcolm Turnbull. And let me contrast it with, and of course you know, simply because of air pollution we have to get rid of coal. Even if we want to spare millions of lives, we have to get rid of coal. So we will certainly do this jump to the renewables. The second, I think, almost forgotten great visionaries was Earl Douglas Haig, British Field Marshal at the Western Front during the First World War. Actually, he was leading his army into the Battle of the Somme just 100 years ago, precisely 100 years ago, where within 5 months, 1 million soldiers died or were mutilated. The biggest disaster in British military history. And he said afterwards, in June 1925, because he was brought up as a cavalry officer, he said, aeroplanes and tanks are only accessories to the man and the horse. And I felt sure, by the time goes on, you will find just as much use for the horse, the well-bred horse, as you have ever done as in the past. And now you see how modern. This is, by the way, the charge of the cavalry in Waterloo in 1815. And you see how modern warfare looks like. No horses. And the same will be true about coal. The question is, how much destruction will you do on the way? So I promised the third great visionary, in my view, would be Philipp Schoeller, because he mentioned something which I also tried to float, namely setting up maybe the greatest public-private partnership in our history, namely transformation fund. You can do it as national funds like the Sovereign Wealth Fund in Norway or in Abu Dhabi. You can do it as an international one. But I think transformation will not happen fast enough. I told you, 3 decades for decarbonization. It has to be a public-private partnership. You need a lot of money. You do not need billions, you need trillions, obviously. The only thing where I would go further than you is, where does the money come from? Huh? The world is awash with money, private equity. It's not invested in infrastructure, nowhere. Of course, you could use a carbon tax. You could use a tax on arms trade, for example. I think that's a splendid idea, and many other things. But if you think back of what I showed you with carbon story, the sea story of mankind, think of the cumulative emissions. The fortunes existing today, not only the Rockefellers, are more or less reflecting the cumulative emissions used for creating that wealth. And the avoided externalities, because if you would have paid for the externalities, all these fortunes would be so much smaller, actually. Yeah? So what is more natural than to say, let's have an inheritance tax reform? Whenever you move ahead your fortune to the next generation, but strictly individually, why not having a generational component in it? Like we have a solidarity tax in Germany for the reunification. If you would use the inheritance tax reform for filling up that transformation fund, you would reach trillions very soon. So that is my proposal to the Club of Rome. Thank you very much.